I'm back. Hi, Carol.
Hi, Sharon. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you again. So, I was reading what you had written for this book, for the 1970s book, and I learned things about you that I hadn't known. So, one of the things that you started with was talking about your traveling and living in other countries in Southern Europe. And so I was really curious to hear more about that and um, how that cultural influence affected your artwork.
And that was a few years ago. I don't even want to think how long ago. No, it was after 2 years of college, and I took a year off and went with a friend and spent about a year traveling. And we ended up mostly where it was warmer and more affordable. And but along the way, like we started in London and bought Penguin books of the history of all these countries we were going to go through, and art history coverage, and then so then as we were going some or spending time somewhere, we'd also read about the history. So because I actually hadn't studied any of that in college and whatever had been required in high school. So it made it very real. It was really interesting. And I mean, I grew up in DC area and visited family in New York a lot. So I always went to museums a fair amount, but the collections and the things I saw at the British Museum, I mean, I still remember seeing in the Egyptian exhibit that there was this little raisin that was a grape that had been buried with somebody, you know, 4,000 years ago or whatever. And, that made such an impression on me. And that sense of time that in America we have I grew up with a much more condensed sense of the 200 or 300 years or something. And so that, and then there were also these beautiful collections of old ancient tools. And I've always had a liking for these displays of the shapes, actually. I took a few pictures when I went back years later. This was well before cell phones. So the whole trip of almost a year, I took 12 pictures because that's the role I had. So,
You have a really good memory. That's impressive.
well, it's funny. It's because I have the pictures and I can count them, and it's like one per country or so. I don't know. It's very, very not what we did then, taking pictures of everything I did. But I did spend time in Spain early on. We spent more time in Spain and rented a little house that normally would be rented to Norwegians or people from up north in the summer, but it was winter, and it was just like this rural seaside life, and it was a very small town, Melisena, but near Melisena, but it was like going back in time, and there were still the towers from the Ottoman Empire, when it had been an Arabic territory. It was south of Granada. So the whole time travel element was probably as significant to me as the physical travel, that sense of the big world.
Mhm.
And so, just watching, I started drawing on this trip too. I'd drawn some in high school, but I hadn't been focused on art. I was focused on psychology and wanting to grow up and help people. And so I started drawing, and just, probably that was just a wonderful way to really look at where I was and see the scenery and see the hills and these old white um, coastal homes that are still like other Arabic countries have. That's how the ancient architecture is. So, and then another place we spent a long time was Greece, camping and staying in small towns. And again, it's a very welcoming culture. Everywhere we were, it was very welcoming. Um, and going through some very exotic areas to ancient what was Yugoslavia then, and being in these areas where they had hardly seen Westerners like us and people, Muslim areas. And the clothing was much more Mideastern. And I was with a friend with long blonde hair, and people were doing the touching the blonde hair thing. And it just, and then the collections in Athens and different in the ruins, and spending time amidst ruins, mostly in Greece and Roman ruins and Greek ruins.
What year was that?
So I graduated in 70. This was late 74, early 75.
So right after high school?
I graduated high school in 72.
Okay, so right after college. Got
it. After my sophomore year, I took a year off. Great. And just took time and lived camping a lot. So it was quite cheap, cooking lentils and that kind of thing. And it just was such a eye-opening experience. And then along the way, I met somebody from California who was studying music therapy. And then I decided, okay, I'll become an art therapist. So that was my plan, to go back to the US and study art therapy and pull together all my interests.
So you're anticipating my third question, but I had one more question after the first one, which was that it seems like your artwork like often departs from research. That you're, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the importance of like research and reading to your art practice, because it feels like from my observation that it's important.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, I can't remember everything, but I know my early installations, which were the first, one of the first things I did working in ceramics ultimately, were based on spending time in the temple ruins, which I found to be very powerful, quiet, sanctuary-like spaces. And since we were traveling off season, and it was a long time ago, there weren't many people in these spaces. And so then before I actually ended up doing the installations a few years later, I was researching the ruins and, who they were built for, who they were worshiping, and how the spaces had been used in the cultures of the time, as best as one could learn. So yeah, I do that. Later, I've in the 80s, I've spent time going down to Guatemala and Mexico, and again, staying in villages and attempting to learn to weave once, things like that. And again, there it was the home altars, and there were stones and places that were ritual oriented, ancient and contemporary. And again, I felt such a draw to that, the spirituality of a preserved culture, which I also always have, Jews have always preserved the culture somehow, moved around. And that's something I felt pretty strongly with the Mayan culture in the areas I was, that people self-preserve their culture somehow despite what happens from the outside. So the home altars, all that, and I do read about it. I do try to learn about it, and it's a real context.
Yeah. I love the connection you made there between those cultures. So I just want to tell you, I hold deep respect for the love and devotion that you bring to your work at San Quentin Prison Arts Project, and it's always a joy to have you like in the classroom or to visit you at San Quentin and to see how much you are a part of that community, and how well respected you are. So I just wanted to know what those early ideas, back to the art therapy, what were your early ideas about art therapy or art as therapy back then, and how did that early interest affect the work that you're doing throughout your career, but now too?
Yes, that's art as therapy, as you say, is much more, it turns out, what the inherent expression and sharing, and depending on, certainly in the prison art studio, the community that shares one's art, even though it's a very private and personal thing, there's a sense of support with the other other art makers in the room, whether or not you're talking. So through different experiences as a work study student, and I worked at psych wards and a jail psych ward and worked with kids in different settings, even like the late 70s when they actually funded things for mental health in California. And I worked in a day treatment program for people that were at board and care homes. Yeah, and the kids' daytime programs were pretty hardy then relative to now. And in all those situations, I wasn't a trained therapist, I wasn't trying to be, but the social workers who I worked with facilitated the idea that just, running art workshops, providing the supplies, depending on the people, talking about the work and what it meant to each person. It really was the idea that creating the art, and I believe sharing it in a community, is healing. It helps make you more whole. And I certainly, it worked for me, it helps me sometimes, that feeling. And I find it necessary and connecting. And I definitely love what it felt like working with people I wouldn't otherwise connect to or know. And that just led to the prison work somehow a long time ago.
And it's amazing how the prison work has just, because you see what the needs are, you understand so well, that it's made you other things. It's made you a curator and an installation of other people's artwork, artist, I don't know, preparator or exhibition designer. Like it's just, you've gained all this other skill set, from just as an outgrowth of that, I think. Yeah.
I've always felt like specifically I was a community outreach person for arts and corrections statewide, and I would set up events with poetry being read, the art being displayed almost always, and also document it and send that documentation back to inside. And I did an installation at one time with self-portrait collages in a space I installed in LA, a couple places. But I had a book for responses, and then I copied that and sent that back to all the participating artists. But I've always seen, like, just, with setting up shows at Alcatraz or Yerba Buena, those shows, that working with the men inside, and I'm only working with men now, it's like saying, okay, here's this group on the outside, they want your work, and what do you, as a group, what would be a good theme? Sometimes groups, the outside people suggest what the theme is, but it's like I'm this little messenger, little birdie, flying over the walls with the artwork. And it's just this getting the voices outside, from where it's so locked away and people drive by and don't look. And right now we're in a moment where there's more awareness of art from prison, and the big show at MoMA, there's a show that's traveling to New York that's at San Jose Museum now, and there is more awareness, and I'm really glad to see that, because it's important voices to listen to.
Thank you so much for your work and being like that connecting thread or the little bird. It's so valuable for all of us. So back to early, like, so you're an East Coast transplant like me. So what aspects of California landscape influenced your work? I know I've read a little bit about what you've written, how it influenced it in the 70s, and then also moving forward.
Yeah. I think it's funny because it was sort of like conjunct with having spent time in the sanctuary spaces, and then looking at these natural formations that one thing that always really impressed me for some reason that I used in my artwork originally was, and when I first moved here, I lived down near Santa Cruz, but the formations along the beach and along the roads there, where the erosion has created all these patterns in the cliffs, and you see the layers of soil or types of soil. Um, and there was just, and it was essentially, may not have been clay soil, but it was awfully related to clay. And it was very literal. And then the rocky fields up in the mountains, I'd never seen giant mountains like the Sierras coming from, the East Coast. And there was something too about the layout of, just these fields with all these gorgeous rocks, and the way the rocks, to my mind, connected to each other, and could refer to walls or structures, but they were random and just placed there by nature. Just those forces are so strong.
Do you think that there's anything, I know that I can see the connection in the early work. Do you think there's still some connection to your work?
I think not so much to erosion and clay. I mean, I've done some clay pieces, but much more to spaces, to sanctuary spaces, which natural spaces are at times too. And so I've done installations, suspended installations, and now I work a lot more on the wall, but or even referring to spaces defined by a lot of hand talk, how I display, arrange components on the wall that make a space where you stand and you're surrounded by them. I think that connects to how I relate to the outdoors and how I find it to be sanctuary-like at times. So that connection is still there, but not so much to clay and the earth in that sense.
Okay, so then like it kind of was like this question, like what are the changes and developments in your artwork when you went from UC Berkeley undergrad program into the MFA program and then moving forward? So can you just talk a little bit about the trajectory there?
Well, an undergraduate, I was doing an independent major, art as therapy. So I was taking some art history, some art practice, some social work practicums. I got to meet Eric Erickson giving a guest class. Just, a lot of different influences. But so I was learning much more about drawing but clay, and also Sid Gordon and welding and working metal. I really took to sculpture. And then there was a year off where I worked in the ceramic studio, and Peter Volkus, and I'd say most of the masters sort of worked from we weren't reading much about art back in that day, but you do it because you feel it, you express it. And, I think I still work from that principle. That can be enough, but there was also the community of women that was there, students like you, people I met, and there was a community of printmakers around Sylvia Lark. And so Rita Robillard and Nancy Macco are still old friends. And there was a lot of support. So even the year I had off and then going into grad school, there was a lot of women's artist community that supported me. And then that overlapped a lot of earth art that was happening then, since I was working in ceramics and looking at art. So that connection of the environmental art, or art about the environment, and women's work, that's still something very meaningful to me and a big part of the wind maps I've been doing and other art over the years. That's one of the big ties. Yeah.
Great. So what and who moving into that area of that time? Who were your big influences back then, or what was your big influence back then? In addition to the earth arts, like was there anyone at Cal in particular that you were working with?
I mean, really, in terms of support and availability of space and go for it and keep making your work, it was the ceramic studio community. And Peter Volkus really did have a lot of support for all of us working there, whether or not, it was equally distributed, but it was a very healthy work community. And some of the people I worked alongside there were still in touch. And but the artist that meant the most to me then, and I feel like it was a lot of young women artists, was Eva Hess and her work, which I could see in New York when I went back east a lot, and she was a huge influence. She worked rebelliously it seemed to me at the time, and in terms of coming off the wall or not, prosaic supplies, not necessarily art supplies. It just everything she was doing seemed incredible to me, and that's still she's one of my favorite artists.
Mine too. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that Mary Miss and the Earth artist Nancy Holt, all that mattered to me a lot too. But Eva Hess was always like just, oh wow, I just
Yeah.
very inspiring, very inspiring.
I agree. Um, so, some of your work, especially like in 1981 when we graduated from with our MFAs together in the Berkeley Art Museum, your work felt more like installation than most of the other artists we were graduating with. So, and you've written about the transitory nature of your installations and working with multiples. So I would just love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Oh, and that's still something that I love in work now, and that they're all parts that you can rearrange and nothing is fixed. And I can find lots of reasons. I think that partly was about non-commercialism. And that may again be related to having been interested in working in communities and teaching in a prison, that kind of work. It's like I've always had another. I don't, not that my work would sell, but I haven't felt the need to do that either, because I sort of feel like my art is for playing essentially with these ideas, creating these forms I can play with, rearrange, and a whole lot of, and I think this was very much in the air then, installation art, but the idea that like I had these 90 small pyramids I'd made, anywhere from 4 inches to a foot or more high, out of clay, high fired. And I would take them to an outdoor setting and, spend time in the space and install them in a way where it felt sort of like those rocks in the Sierras, where they were like integrated into the space. Or if I set them up indoors, they would respond to the space and maybe create an enclosure, or sometimes create lines or rows or something that seemed to respond to the space for me. And I like the impermanence of multiples, and the fact that you never glue them down and you keep playing with them. And the first things I did, we had this huge extruder in the studio at Cal, and it extruded these logs that were like, clay logs, except they were weird and wonky. But we could fire them, but they were like 4 more inches high by 3 by 3 or something, like these big chunks of clay with really, different colorants added, different iron oxides and stuff, and then high fired. And then I could literally, build with them. So I loved it. I made little enclosures, I made walls. It was fun.
Do you still have some of those multiples? Do you have them?
The smaller ones, a few samples. Mostly, I think over time, people put 1 or 2 in their garden here, there, and everywhere. I mean, you can't move big lumps of fired clay forever. So.
That's the problem us artists, visual artists have when we make stuff.
A lot of history that it's hard to let go of.
Yeah, it's a hard one. So, was there anything going on in the art scene back then or now, and now that you're already talked about like earthworks and all of that. So moving forward, then, what what ideas, what artists are you looking at?
Hmm. One other element that really was in the air in from coming to Berkeley and being in Clinton was funk also just, and I think I'm still real attracted to the mark of the hand, the irregular, the that just feels really good. And it's kind of funny bringing those values that I have like that inside teaching in prison or somewhere where people want some rules and like how to make things work right. And trying to, and of course I'd rather try to provide the information people want, but I'm really interested in and influenced by the funk movement in that sense, and putting things together that aren't necessarily normally put together. But I really think that ecofeminism, I guess, would be one of the biggest movements and fields of interest to me, that there's such a connection to, I guess it's that there's a practical side, that it's trying to heal, trying to help, trying to bring awareness, people that do amazing work like building actual gardens and actually changing, saving the water from going into ruining a creek, or that's runoff that shouldn't be there. It just, that I find that very inspiring and always will. I think there's a lot of feminist art that I like, and I like, again, voices that need to be heard. So that's sort of a permanent fixture too for me.
So what else in the Bay Area, um, back then and till now, are influences that are outside of the art world that you feel like really influence your work or just your life as a person? you know, what what else? Yeah.
Well, I think it's the social justice community here is, it just makes it feel so comfortable in terms of finding other people that share my values, and people that inspire me, that are doing a lot and working in community, and um, you know support the kind of work I do, and have amazing work they're doing in the unhoused community or in other work, just amazing things that are happening, that is, and sharing through arts where it's just such a fundamental connection for people, so that it sort of honors everybody. I feel when you're working with art in whatever community, whether it's academic or people feel respected, I think, for having their own interest in art, their own sensibilities seen and shared. And then they're really amazed if those get seen and shared with the outside world. And I mean, we all like having shows actually, but it's just great when people who don't normally have those kinds of opportunities are respected and the work is valued.
So the last question had to do with like how those values in your life as a person, and as a thinker and as an artist, like just inform the work you're doing today. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about what you're working on.
Well, thanks. Yeah. I think the value of, one of the biggest sort of awarenesses I've had working, inside the prisons for 35 plus years now, is how much I get out of it. That it's, people will be like, oh, thank you. And it's not bad. They're thanking me for coming in or something, but I'm saying thank you. I'm learning so much. I'm sharing a lot. Um, it's just it's a reciprocal it was frozen there, but oh well. But it's a reciprocal experience. So that reciprocity now means a lot to me, that I've learned and that I share, and that, you know, it's like giving is getting, maybe. I don't know. But that's a value that's still a lot, has a lot of meaning to me. And then the piece I've started working on now, I was doing a lot of wind maps. I've done a couple projects with art during the pandemic, with group projects where I had conversation with someone in India, and all these different artists had conversations, and there's a website now, and we did some really, it felt so good to do that work. But I've gone back to a theme that I have worked on before briefly, about a relative that survived Auschwitz. He was a tailor. Our family has been tailors, and my mother's family. And he survived Auschwitz as a tailor, and, you know, made clothes for German families as well as Jewish families. Just, you know, I've thought about it and thought about it. So now I'm working, before I've worked with putting images and thin things, you know, sort of memorial type things, but I've done, you know, endangered species, drawings of endangered species between two layers of silk. So they're sort of moving and gone at times, depending how you look in that moire effect. So now I'm making sort of memorial pieces of children's clothing that might have been German kids. You know, I've looked at pictures of clothing from that era and layering them between silk, and they're roughly knitted, and it's just going to be a whole lot of different size pieces, different colors, all memorializing the vast nightmare, but all those kids, and honoring my relative and all this, the resilience that people amazingly have. So,
you know, it's interesting. That's one more intersection of our work, like working with memory loss, you know, honoring memory, memorial. Interesting.
yeah, I guess it really comes up now during the pandemic too. I mean, it feels needed now. Yeah.
Well, this has been amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharon.
Conversations. We should do this more often.
I know, it's really great to like just actually talk about your work, and we have so many intersections. I love it. Yeah.
It's lovely. Should we turn off the recording, or should we keep going? How are we doing with time?
Oh, I think we're done time-wise.
Well, thank you, Carol.
Okay, thank you. But we should keep talking.